Rain slid down the windshield in heavy sheets, turning the lonely roadside into a blur of gray and red lights. Marcus Hale gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, trying to ignore the hollow ache in his stomach. The court hearing was tomorrow morning. One decision from a stranger behind a judge's bench would decide whether he would lose the tiny apartment he shared with his 6-year-old son, or keep the only life they had left. And then he saw her. A red car sat crooked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. Beside it stood a woman in a soaked red dress, struggling to lift something from the trunk while rain soaked her hair and face. She looked frustrated, stranded, and completely alone in the darkness of the rural highway. Marcus slowed without thinking. For a moment he considered driving past. His truck barely had enough gas to reach home. His wallet carried only a few crumpled dollars. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether a small mistake from years ago would destroy his life. Helping someone right now felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. But then a thought quietly settled in his chest. What if this were you standing in the rain, hoping someone would stop? The truck rolled to a stop. Marcus stepped out into the downpour and walked toward the woman. Up close, she looked startled but relieved. Rain dripped from her face as she tried to explain that her tire had blown out and the jack in the trunk was stuck. Her voice carried the strained calm of someone trying not to panic. Marcus didn't ask questions. He simply knelt beside the tire and began working. His hands were rough and trembling slightly from exhaustion, but years of fixing his own broken things had taught him patience. The lug nuts resisted at first, rusted and stubborn, but slowly they gave way. The woman stood nearby holding an umbrella that barely helped against the wind. Marcus could feel her watching him with quiet curiosity. To her, he probably looked like just another worn-down man in a faded jacket. She couldn't see the nights he spent worrying about rent, the extra shifts at the warehouse, or the way his son Jonah waited by the window every evening just to make sure his father came home. Life had carved lines into Marcus's face long before his time. 20 minutes later, the spare tire was finally secured. Marcus wiped rain and grease from his hands and stood up slowly. The woman thanked him with genuine relief, reaching into her purse as if to offer money. Marcus shook his head before she could finish. He simply told her that sometimes people help each other because that's the only way the world keeps moving forward. Then he returned to his truck before the rain could hide the quiet embarrassment in his eyes. Accepting money would have made the kindness feel smaller. The woman watched the old pickup disappear down the dark road. For a long moment, she stood silently beside her car. Something about the man's tired expression had stayed with her. The next morning, the courthouse in Cedar Ridge felt colder than usual. Marcus sat in the wooden bench outside courtroom 3, his hands clasped tightly together. His case was small compared to most criminal hearings, but to him it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Years earlier, during a desperate winter when Jonah was sick and bills had piled up, Marcus had been caught taking construction materials from a job site where he worked. It had been a stupid decision made during a moment of panic. Since then, he had paid fines, completed probation, and spent every day trying to rebuild his life. But now the company was pressing for harsher penalties. If the judge ruled against him, Marcus could face eviction and possibly jail time. Jonah's small drawing folded in Marcus's pocket suddenly felt heavier than anything else in the room. The courtroom doors opened. Marcus walked in slowly, heart pounding against his ribs. He barely looked up as the judge entered and everyone stood. His eyes remained fixed on the worn floorboards as the hearing began. Words floated through the room, case numbers, statements, legal arguments, but they sounded distant, almost unreal. Then the judge spoke directly to him. Marcus finally raised his head, and his breath caught in his throat. Behind the bench sat the woman from the roadside. Judge Rebecca Turner looked just as surprised. For a brief moment their eyes met in stunned recognition. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Panic surged through him like ice water. Of all the possible people who could hold his future in their hands, it had to be the same stranger he had helped in the rain. A terrible thought crept into his mind. Maybe she would think he stopped to help because he somehow knew who she was. Maybe she would believe his kindness had been an act. Marcus lowered his gaze again, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The hearing continued. Rebecca listened carefully to the attorneys, reviewing Marcus's history and the circumstances of the case. On paper, the law was clear. The company had the right to demand stricter consequences. Judges were meant to follow the law, not their emotions. But Rebecca couldn't stop remembering the image of that man kneeling in the rain. silently fixing her tire with hands that clearly carried the weight of a hard life. He hadn't asked for anything, he hadn't even waited to be thanked, and he certainly hadn't known who she was. Rebecca studied the file again. A single father, years of clean records since the incident, steady work, community service. Letters from neighbors describing him as a devoted parent who worked himself to exhaustion just to provide for his son. The law allowed discretion in cases of rehabilitation. Rebecca felt the courtroom watching her as she prepared to speak. Marcus stood there quietly, expecting the worst. When the judge finally delivered the decision, her voice was calm but firm. She acknowledged the seriousness of the original mistake, but also recognized the years Marcus had spent proving that one moment did not define his entire life. Instead of harsher punishment, she ordered the case officially closed, citing rehabilitation and community responsibility. Marcus didn't move at first. The words felt unreal. Then the meaning finally reached him, and his shoulders trembled with silent relief. The future he feared losing had just been handed back to him. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus paused near the door. Judge Turner was gathering her papers, her expression thoughtful. For a moment he considered speaking, but words felt impossible. Some things were too heavy for simple thanks. Rebecca looked up and gave him a small nod. It wasn't the nod of a judge acknowledging a case. It was the nod of a stranger remembering kindness in the rain. Marcus walked outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting from his chest. For the first time in years, the world seemed a little less cruel. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion could echo further than anyone expected. And somewhere in the city, a young boy named Jonah would soon see his father walk through the door with hope in his eyes again. Before this story ends, pause for a moment and tell us in the comments. If you had been Marcus, struggling with everything he carried, would you still have stopped to help that stranger in the storm? Because sometimes the world changes not through power or money, but through quiet moments when ordinary people choose kindness, even when life has been unkind to them. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people can hear stories that remind us how powerful a simple act of goodness can truly be.